Phillip, Nick, and Devin, thank you for joining us for this conversation on the road to the metaverse as a part of Index's inaugural first ever creator summit. So really grateful to have all of you here. I think on the metaverse, the first time I ever heard the term was when I read Ready Player One in anticipation of meeting Dave Baszucki at Roblox. So I think I was far later, probably decades later than the three of you, who I know have been thinking about this for a long time. And really from a first principles perspective, what should the metaverse look like? So I'm looking forward today to having a discussion about that and also whether it has in fact arrived. So Phillip, I'm going to actually start with you as co-founder and CEO of Gather, a place for virtual gatherings online that you started with your co-founders at the beginning of COVID. And there has been remote work that has happened in Gather, like happy hours, birthdays, and then my favorite, even some weddings that have happened in Gather. I'm very curious to get your view on, the metaverse seemed to be this thing that was in the future, but has it arrived? Do we live in the metaverse today thanks to COVID? And will there be one or many metaverses?
Yeah, so I guess I feel similarly where for a while we'd kind of been dreaming about, what can virtual worlds do for interaction? How will it, completely change the way people like interact for better? And it was always in my mind kind of like a far off thing. It was like hardware was going to get really great in VR and AR and these interfaces. And I think with COVID, it was like, oh, actually, all of a sudden the social acceptance to try some of these new things to experiment was a lot better. And with it, I think people saw that some of these interactions are actually better long term, right? Just after they tried it. So for example, with remote work, people really like the flexibility and they're actually able to be pretty productive. And the part that's missing that the metaverse kind of brings is the sense of connection and belonging and being in the same place. Otherwise, with people, they've been able to hang out more with like friends and family who aren't near them. And I think to us, that's really what the metaverse represents more so than any particular form factor or particular world. It's more so like this virtual layer over the physical world where people are interacting. And to that extent, I think it has already shown up on Gather, like with all those use cases that you mentioned, but also, other platforms like RecRoom and other virtual worlds. And what it means, what really it means to us for the metaverse to have arrived is like people are actually having jobs that they couldn't have before because now like it's way more accessible virtually, or like new kinds of experiences that people are doing socially that didn't exist before. So yeah, like I think it's really cool to see everything that's happened. COVID's really accelerated a lot. And it's definitely kind of like this broader ecosystem that's forming around it.
So Phillip, you think it's here today, but are there one or many?
Yeah. So I think long term, there's like one metaverse in the same way that there's one internet, but there's many, many different players in kind of like the internet space, right? So like if you think about the internet, it was built with like these open protocols, and there's many people at the layer of like infrastructure, like Cisco and like Cloudflare and people like that. And there's even like many browsers on top of it. And then even on top of that, of course, there's like tons and tons of different websites, some that are even able to be like, $1 trillion companies. And I think it's similar in the metaverse where it's very much not going to be built by one company. There's going to be many people at many different layers of the stack. And it's kind of best also built with like the open protocols as decentralized as possible. And it's pretty exciting to see that. I think that's actually a broader movement with like blockchain stuff and this new ethos being built around it. So.
Oh, good. We've got a crypto mention. We're only so many minutes into it. Well, Nick, I would love to talk to you about your vision for the metaverse. So as co-founder and CEO of RecRoom, you've been kind of convicted about immersive digital experiences for a long time. And one of the things that we're so excited about RecRoom is that there are thousands of creators that are actually creating within RecRoom their own digital world. So would love to talk to you a little bit about how you thought about building a platform and how to get kind of an organic community of users engaged.
Yeah, at this point, RecRoom is the product of over 3 million different creators who have built either rooms or objects inside of the RecRoom universe. And how we ended up there was not by plan. It was probably more by necessity. there are so many places for developers to go and build content. And I think in many ways, the battle of the web right now is where can you pull in developers to help you build out your platform? And we were just subscale for a while. It wasn't possible for us to go to these folks who have so many other options that are, really strong, that have very strong financial incentives, and be like, hey, come build for my corner of the universe that's relatively small. The thing that we did have was we did have users who were passionate and creative, and really motivated to try and build their own spaces, their own worlds, their own objects. They really wanted to participate in this ecosystem that had kind of excluded them, that was kind of just focused on devs. So I think from the get-go, RecRoom had really been thinking about how do we become a dev platform? And then as time went on, we saw, hey, we have these users who are so motivated and love our brand so much. If we start building tools for them instead of tools for these folks who already have a really robust tool set, we can create something very unique and different. And we can create this like really symbiotic relationship with the people who are already in the RecRoom ecosystem. So like anything that I think leads to a really unexpected space, it wasn't something that was planned out from the get-go. It was sort of a place that our users led us. And I'm really happy that we like followed that thread.
And Nick, I'm curious what, the anthropologist in me is like, what are people building in RecRoom? Like one of the things, Phillip, we've discussed is that people tend to replicate their actual real world environments. So, I want to recreate my favorite art gallery or my favorite place where I lived in Ghana, who knows? What are you seeing people build imaginary worlds, ones that attach to their digital lives? Like, and what tools are emergent from that?
People are creating everything. I think the desire to create is really deeply ingrained in humans. I mean, millions and millions of years ago, you see cave paintings. Like these things don't serve a purpose. It was someone trying to express some idea that they have. And I think it's just like very deeply ingrained in our brains. I think there's so many people that spend portions of their lives in games and in digital spaces, but they just have very low ability to affect those spaces. And I think RecRoom is one of those places where you can go and you can design your own world. And whether that's an escape room or a battle royale island or a book club or a private, beach house for you and your friends, RecRoom is a place that's you can very accessibly go and build those things. I think there's so many people in the world that like want to have some impact on the world, and their inability to do so sometimes manifests in like really negative ways. I think if you look at teenagers and like the frequency with which they are tagging and graffitiing things, I think that's a desire to like, I want to put my mark on the world, but I just don't have the capabilities to do it in a really constructive way. So I think a lot of what we're trying to do in RecRoom is take that impulse to want to have an impact on your world, to want to be creative, to want people to want to be able to distribute the things that you've created and find an audience for them. For RecRoom, we're just trying to channel that in a very unique direction.
Yeah, it makes me think, you mentioned like the human desire for creativity, but also the need for experimentation. Like I was just thinking, you could build a bunch of little societies and see, this one votes this way and this one votes the other. Well, you can tell my political interest, but how do they emerge over time? Like what, do you end up with the Lord of the Flies scenario? But anyway, the ability to live in multiple realities at the same time is quite exciting. Devin, I'd love to bring you into this conversation. So as the co-founder and CEO of OpenSea, you're really leading the frontier of digital goods as the largest NFT marketplace out there, and would really, NFTs have made it possible to have kind of ownership of digital assets, and would really love to understand, how you think they play a role in the metaverse. And my favorite subject, which Phillip already mentioned, is this idea of we've had digital currencies, and then we have digital goods, and then next are there jobs that people will be having kind of in the metaverse that may or may not exist offline. So if that's enough questions in one, over to you.
Sure. Yeah, and to just expand on some of the answers around is the metaverse here or not, I think there's always that quote, the future is here, it just hasn't been evenly distributed yet. And I think that definitely applies in this situation, right? There's like people who are experiencing the metaverse today, but it's actually probably a small number of people, right? If you look at like the number of people who are buying and selling NFTs or experiencing VR on an everyday basis, it has not yet penetrated the mainstream, but you can go and experience these things. It's just the sort of distribution hasn't happened to the same extent that it has with other technologies. But I think one really cool way or lens to look at all of this is, it's a very unique time where there's so many frontier technologies that seem like they're kind of on the cusp of an exponential growth curve. So artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and crypto, all of these things seem like they're in roughly similar stages where they're all like they have this early adopter traction, but they haven't kind of gone completely parabolic yet. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how all of those things like stitch together into a really interesting, like we haven't seen, for example, we've seen a little bit of kind of intersection of NFTs with virtual reality environments, but only kind of, again, at like a microscopic scale. And so I think we'll see like more and more of that. And it may be messy, it may kind of take a while. But I think that's kind of where a lot of the potential lies, is stitching together all those things. But to answer your question around the digital goods, I think if you look at kind of some of the people who are the ultra early adopters of NFTs, they are spending 90 to 100% of their time in that world, and have oftentimes completely left their traditional jobs to be an NFT artist or an NFT collector or curator, or someone who's playing a role in the NFT market. And that, that's, again, it's sort of already happening. It's just a small number of people who are actually able to do that. And that is really, I think, a lot of what people talked about with sort of some of these future jobs, where you're like a virtual reality architect, or you're like a virtual land real estate agent. We've seen some of those people, and it's just that there's like a small number of them right now. So it's exciting to see all of that come to fruition.
It's one of my favorite debates in the field of economics, which is like when you have these technological developments, you mentioned many of them, Devin, at the beginning, is, do you end up with less jobs or more jobs net? And I think the view is always that, are the robots coming argument is that you actually end up with this whole new set of jobs, and many that we take for granted today, even like, software developer wasn't around, certainly 100 years ago. So I think, it's easy to think the world has always been like you've seen it. One thing you said, Devin, is about the distribution, that like not everyone has experienced the metaverse yet. I'm curious, like what drives the crossing the chasm into broad distribution? Because one of the things that's so exciting about all of your products is like you just need a browser, right? You're not waiting for another technology. And for so long, that's what people thought was the key to crossing that. And obviously that's not it. So what do you think maybe it's Twitter. What do you think drives the distribution to more the person who's not, Philip's team with a penguin NFT and Gather today?
Yeah, my guess is, looking specifically at crypto, since that's the place where I understand it the best. It may be slightly different in virtual reality world, but I think it's just companies that like vertically integrate and provide sort of a consumer friendly experience and user education, and kind of help guide people across. It's sort of like the AOL, right, where you have this kind of maybe it's a sort of dumbed down version, or walled garden, and you like really nail these distribution mechanisms, right? So AOL was, in that case, it was actually mailing people discs to set it. I'm kind of talking BSing here a little bit, because I actually don't, I'm just sort of third party. I remember a little bit of this, but I was quite young. But those sorts of like tactics, company tactics, where you're providing like a much more vertically integrated experience, and then looking at clever distribution tactics, I think are kind of what will facilitate that. So it's not really, I don't know if there's a silver bullet, at least on the crypto side. It's more of a just general maturation of the user experience, the technology, kind of all in concert. That's my rough sense. But it provides really great opportunity for entrepreneurs who can go and say like, okay, here's how we like bring that customer from the mainstream awareness to being interested in this.
I think if you look at the adoption of the internet or mobile devices, it really keys in on what are you providing to consumers. I think it generally starts with like novelty. So this is just like a cool but very difficult way to do this thing. It eventually will transition to utility. So there is one aspect of my life that this performs much better at. That moment might, like for mobile, it might have been the BlackBerry. Like it was like, oh, now I can have email on the go. And then I think it transitions to necessity. This is a technology that I cannot live without. That's kind of where we are with mobile right now. Like it would be like people feel physical pain when separated from their phone. Like I literally can't manage my life without it. And I think we're still in the novelty section of for most of this. There's pockets of utility that are popping up. And I think you see that demonstrated by, people making very real amounts of money in the crypto space and being able to quit their job and go and like build a living around this. I think you see it in other spaces where people are using these games for very non-game utilities, like weddings, family reunions, catching up with college friends. Like these are not traditional game scenarios that are now, being co-opted by the gaming space. I wouldn't say any of this has transitioned to necessity yet. And I think that feels like it's further away. When we look at the metaverse term, like 10 years from now, my guess is it doesn't age super well. It might look like information superhighway. Like it's directionally correct, but I think a lot of our intuitions about what this looked like might be wrong. And I think it's hard to know exactly what this looks like in the future, whether it's one company, whether it's open protocols. I think the part that I am feeling pretty confident about is that people's lives are going to continue to transition more and more from the physical space to the digital space. I don't know exactly what format that takes, but I think that's what sitting at the intersection of each of these components is like, I'm represented I'm represented as a digital avatar, or I'm paying with a currency that's purely digital, or I'm buying items that are purely digital. That feels like the transition that's happening. And I think we'll be in the metaverse when like e-commerce right now, that's probably the bulk of where I buy my goods. I think we will truly be in the metaverse, and it will be a utility where the bulk of the goods or the bulk of like our GMV or is taking place in this digital realm. That would probably be the test for me.
Yeah, I think to add on to Nick's point, I love to make the analogy of like the internet as like a major shift that also happened. And just like you mentioned, like I think over time the use cases turn from like novelty, like early adopters, to more widespread adoption. And I think what the underlying kind of thing happening there is like over time the underlying ecosystem and the platform develops, and as a result the number of use cases broadens. I think on the analogy for the internet is right, like as more and more people got in the browsers, more people were incentivized to create different kinds of websites. And as people were able to do like video and do like live stuff on browsers, or even like rendering engines, you get things like new kind of tools like Figma, or like, the cloud makes things way easier to develop. And I think it's going to be somewhat similar for the metaverse, where like, I think prior to COVID, a lot of it was kind of in gaming, and over time it expands. And I think Gather's a version of that, where it's like, oh, let's do kind of like these ideas, but for everything non-gaming, right? And then like, let's develop some of these tools that people need to build all the like non-gaming use cases over time. And honestly, we just need to wait for like a lot of that to happen. I think it's happening really quickly, and that's exciting. But
Devin, one thing, I think, Nick, your framework of kind of novelty utility is interesting. One concept that resonates deeply with me in the NFT world is this idea of patronage. Like when we all talk about, like, there are things in our real world life that we want to have kind of exist in the metaverse, but then there are net new things that are possible. And, not saying patronage is a net new concept, but the idea that you can actually attribute value creation to the person who created it, like, is a new ability that exists in digital goods and can exist in the metaverse. So Devin, I'm curious to get your thoughts on kind of when that comes, how that kind of concept of patronage, is that down the line? Are we seeing it now? Am I going to have a hybrid job where I'm investing in some metaverse companies and some, I don't know, in Silicon Valley? Love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think from the lens of NFTs, the sort of new innovation is this idea of property rights that go beyond just one particular application, right? So in online games, people have been buying digital goods for many years, but they've sort of just been confined to that one ecosystem, and the willingness to spend is already quite high, but it could be quite larger, and the applications that one could do with whatever they buy are just so much bigger, right? Those digital assets can move around between lots of different ecosystems and sort of have a life of their own. You can sort of have the trust that this digital item is going to stick around, versus it feeling much more ephemeral. And I think that lends itself to this idea that you could have patronage in the digital world, where you're buying a piece of digital art, and it's seen as both a way to support the artist or the creator, but also something that lasts like almost indefinitely into the future in all of these different virtual environments. And again, it's sort of happening on this microscopic scale, and actually, larger and larger scale as NFTs enter the mainstream awareness. So I think, it's definitely one of those kind of use cases for crypto and NFTs that's being enabled.
One question, I think we've talked a lot about kind of the optimistic new possibilities of the metaverse, but a lot of the portrayal, at least in literature and film, of the metaverse has been a little bit dystopian, right? And Ready Player One, the Oasis was, there's an evil corporation that was trying to control it. I'm curious kind of how you guys think about the causes for optimism, and kind of what's net new possible, or is there a dystopian version of the future? Does this go wrong? I mean, there's obviously a lot of online bullying. There are things we could, so I'm curious, like optimistic, pessimistic, dystopian.
Well, to go back to the dystopian portrayals in novels and films, I mean, I think you've seen this with AI as well. The dystopian depiction doesn't mean that this is bad. It means that it's important and perilous. There are ways that this can go right, and then there are ways that this can go very wrong. I think the same is probably true in the AI space. So with the metaverse, I think that the key area that everyone keeps honing in on is control and probably agency. Like, what agency do I have as an individual with my information and my goods and my money and my relationships and my privacy? What control do I have over those? And I think that the perilous world is potentially the one where I don't have any agency over any of those, because one entity controls the bulk of the metaverse. And I think that's the dystopian, prediction. I think if you look at areas where social media has potentially gone wrong, it has been this lack of agency that individuals have had on these platforms. But the more choice there is, potentially the more agency you have, because you can move from one place to another. So I think that's really where this line is drawn for me, is what single entity, what is the largest single entity? What level of control do they have over this new space? I think with the internet, we got really lucky. Like, no one player can take down the internet or control it entirely. And I think most of our problems stem from one entity maybe has too much control over one area. So I think the more that we can focus on a metaverse that's the product of many different companies and viewpoints, I think the more likely we are to avoid that dystopian future.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think one other vision that gets talked about when we think dystopian universe is like a world in which people are kind of hooked into a virtual reality headset for like 24 hours per day and don't really leave. And I think like that's not the future that any of us are really kind of like fighting for. It's more so like, I think the way it'll actually show up is that the metaverse will show up as like an addition to the physical world, rather than like an exact replacement, in the sense that even within our own company that's all working out of our virtual office, like we still think about what is the right cadence for us to get together in person, right? How can we fly out everyone from all around the world to get together? Or like for social interactions, like you're not only going to interact with people virtually, you're going to see the people you can see in person, but for people like you can't see, or for particular new experiences, you might do that virtually. And so it's very much so like it gets used as much as it's positive kind of thing. And I think the last point to make there is like, in these in these novels, the metaverse was used as kind of an escape from a bad reality. And I think in our case, like what's important to keep in mind here is like the metaverse is actually also an improvement over the status quo. In a world where like, real life is really great, the metaverse still adds value in like new kinds of jobs being created, like new kinds of social experiences, etc.
Yeah, just to add on Nick's previous point around, or it was interesting, or what Nick said was really interesting to me. And I think the other thing to think about is like, so there's these, maybe centralized institutions that have control, and then also like, what are the business models attached to those companies, right? Because the advertising-based business model has sort of created this attention economy where they're sort of juicing. It's just this very backward situation that no one really planned out or decided was great for consumers, or even, I mean, it's not even really optimal for businesses either. And so I think what's exciting, not to say that it will necessarily go in a universally positive direction, but it is exciting to see, things like crypto and NFTs enable more direct business models where the value transfer happens directly between a artist and a patron, or just a very different model than kind of the current model that social media companies are employing. And it's just interesting to see that model was sort of an artifact of all of these really weird constraints of how the internet worked. And now we're sort of breaking down those constraints, adding additional tools and additional infrastructure. And so we're sort of not exactly correcting some of those, but at least enabling people to experiment with other things.
I wonder if, Devin, you took business model away. I mean, the key thing that's burning in my mind is network effects. So Nick, to your point on like the internet went one way, social networks went the other way. And my understanding of why there's kind of agglomeration economics and there being one platform is the network effect nature of the business. And then I start thinking, okay, well, does the metaverse have network effects? Are there like intergalactic effects? You heard that here first. So I'm just wondering, like, that you could imagine the dynamics in the metaverse being similar, that I want to go where I can find Phillip and Devin and Nick in all these, different worlds. So I'm curious if anyone agree, disagree, dispel.
Yeah,
actually, I think there's potential for very strong network effects. Yes, I think most people's version of the metaverse is a combination of a marketplace and a social graph and a discovery mechanism and an app store, kind of all rolled into one. Many things that have very strong network effects kind of interlocked together. So I think the potential for this to end up in the hands of a very small number of individuals is a thing to be mindful of.
Actually, I this is actually where I'm the most excited about, like, decentralization. I think there's actually a room for a new paradigm of thing to exist here, where, for example, it's not just currencies that are kind of on the blockchain, it's actually like data, right? And so you could imagine a world in which, like, let's say the social graph is on the blockchain, right? And now it's no longer the case that there's one company that owns the social graph. Many other people can build on top of it and compete on top of it, kind of to Nick's earlier point. And you can build it in a way so that, like, everything is decentralized in a way that couldn't before. There's actually a network effect across the whole broader platform. And very much not one company. It's like, at that point, it's kind of like philosophically nice. It feels kind of like a public good that has a network effects rather than any one company.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not a given. I think Nick's point is also right. Like, you don't necessarily get there. Someone could get there first as a centralized company, and you don't get to build that.
I wonder if there's a backlash against it, right? I mean, I think that's actually the thing that, from policy land where I used to spend time, like, how do you design it so that it happens differently? And like, who makes those decisions? Like, if we all decide we want it to not have, we want to have many metaverses, that seems to be a shared view. Like, how do you design with that in mind? Can you, when it's like collective action across wide, across the world, basically. But I don't know that we're going to solve that today, but I'm glad we got to the meat of it by the end. And Devin, Nick, Phillip, thank you very, very much. And I hope the next one of these conversations happens in the metaverse.
Same. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.